We're a 1.2 trillion economy, and I think it's going to be very effective.
Imagine a hall in downtown Toronto, the Imperial Club, the glint of glasses, the whisper of business circles, and suddenly silence. The Premier of Canada's largest province takes the stage. He smiles, pauses, and with that very northern imperturbability says, "We need to acknowledge the elephant in the room." Laughter. But behind this joke lies a blow, because the elephant is Donald Trump and his new wave of tariffs, which, according to many, could change the continent's economy.
And then I went on to tell him if I ever see him in the parking lot, he's going to get a beating like he's never got before. But that's what you have to do.
This speech began as a social lunch, but it ended as an economic declaration of war. Tired of being in the shadows, Canada responded to the US for the first time in decades, not with diplomacy, but with action. In an instant, the province of Ontario turned the threat from Washington into an opportunity. While the White House was tightening tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, Toronto was introducing its own levies on electricity exports to the US states. The message was clear: if you build a wall, we can build our own. This story is not about minor trade disputes. It's a story about how one province challenged the very idea of America first. And it's not just politics, it's survival. Every factory in Windsor, every assembly line in Hamilton feels the impact of American tariffs. Hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake. But instead of complaints and letters to Washington, there is determination. Ontario is launching a massive campaign with a message once uttered by Ronald Reagan himself: protectionism is the road to decline.
Pull up behind him and jump out of the car. I said, "Buddy, what's in your bag?" "Nothing's in my bag." I said, "Buddy, I'm going to kick your ass all over the parking lot. Show me what's in your bag."
While the US is talking louder and louder about bringing back jobs, the numbers show the opposite. Manufacturing is falling. Thousands of Americans are losing their jobs. In Canada, however, there is growth in investment, new factories, and a surge in domestic production. The irony is that tariffs, conceived as a weapon against rivals, have become fuel for economic revival across the border. Meanwhile, a new game is unfolding in Beijing and Ottawa. China is pressuring Canada with tariffs on canola, and Canada is responding with restrictions on electric vehicles. And now the government in Ottawa is seriously considering a move that could turn the tables, removing tariffs on Chinese EVs. Not in support of China, but for the sake of its own farmers, who find themselves caught between two fires. And what about America? In the heart of the Midwest, there is alarm. Farmers are going bankrupt, soybeans are sitting in barns, equipment is becoming more expensive, and debts are growing. What began as a promise to protect American producers has turned into a crisis where only competitors are winning.
Let's take Ronald Reagan's words and let's blast it to the American people. And our first launch is going to be on every major network. Maybe one may not get it.
Today, Canada, once the junior partner in the North American alliance, is acting on its own terms for the first time. It does not ask, wait, or agree. It is building its own economy, its own rules, and its own future. This is not just a trade war. It is the beginning of a new era when allies become rivals and the weak learn to be independent. You are watching an investigation into how one speech in Toronto marked the beginning of the end of the American tariff empire. It was a dry autumn in Toronto. The air smelled of overheated metal and anxiety. Stock charts were slowly sliding downward. Analysts were arguing about the numbers. But everyone understood one thing: the new wave of tariffs from Washington would hit hard. Against this backdrop, lunch at the Imperial Club, one of Canada's oldest and most respectable establishments, promised to be something of a ritual, an exchange of pleasantries, applause, and hope that everything would somehow work out. But things did not go according to plan. When the Ontario Premier stepped up to the microphone, the audience expected cautious words. Instead, he began with a phrase that instantly shattered the atmosphere: "We need to acknowledge the elephant in the room." Light laughter, muted applause. But there was more defiance than diplomacy in this joke.
We're going to launch a $75 million ad, and we're going to repeat that message to every Republican district there is, right across the entire country.
By that point, Trump had been increasing tariff pressure on Canada for several months. New duties on steel, aluminum, cars, even wood and rare earth metals, all under the banner of economic security. The White House explained the policy simply: America must bring manufacturing back home. But for Canada, it sounded like a death sentence. More than 70% of Canadian exports went to the US, and every new percentage point of duty meant the risk of closed factories and layoffs. When the Prime Minister uttered his words, everyone in the room felt it, from industrialists to journalists. It was the moment Canada stopped whispering. The speech itself had not been agreed upon in advance with Ottawa. It was said that federal circles awaited it with apprehension, too risky, too sharp. But the Ontario leader decided otherwise. He understood that if he remained silent now, there would be nothing left to defend later. And so, after a brief joke, he stated bluntly, "Ontario will not allow anyone to dictate how we work, trade, and earn a living. We are not asking for concessions. We are demanding respect." From that moment on, the atmosphere in the room changed. The reserved businessman, accustomed to compromise, sensed something rare in political speeches: confidence. This statement was not just about dissatisfaction with tariffs. It was a declaration of independence. The next day, newspapers wrote about a moment in history and new Canadian directness. But behind the words were actions. A week later, the Ontario government announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota regions that are heavily dependent on Canadian supplies. This decision was a symbolic response. If Washington wants to play tariff games, Ontario is ready to respond in kind. Experts immediately called the move risky but strategic. According to local media reports, each megawatt-hour of electricity sent south now brought Ontario about $4.5 million a month, money that had previously been lost.
Ideally, no tariffs, and ideally a good deal for Canada, and I think that's the number one objective. Not just any deal, but a good deal and certainty for workers and for businesses in Canada.
But more importantly, this move had a psychological effect. American governors, especially in border states, began to openly express concern. According to Bloomberg, just 3 weeks after the surcharge was introduced, U.S. energy companies filed complaints with the Federal Commission, saying that the price increase jeopardizes the stability of the region's energy supply. Meanwhile, a $75 million campaign was launched in Toronto. It was based on an old quote by Ronald Reagan that protectionism is a tax on your own citizens. The ads were placed not only in Canada, but also in American business publications, from the Wall Street Journal to the Chicago Tribune. The campaign had a double effect. Domestically, it reinforced the confidence that Canada could act on its own without Washington's permission. Abroad, especially in U.S. states that were heavily dependent on Canadian supplies, it caused irritation. But irritation is also a reaction. And that was exactly what Toronto wanted. Ontario was feeling growing public fatigue at the time. For several years in a row, factories had been closing due to unstable trading conditions. In Windsor, where auto parts for General Motors were manufactured, 300 people were being laid off every week. In Hamilton, steel companies were losing contracts, and in Niagara Falls, power plants were idle. Hundreds of thousands of workers saw how decisions made in Washington were destroying their lives. And now, for the first time, someone said what they were thinking, that Canada had the right to defend itself.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This determination quickly turned into policy. By September, the Industrial Sovereignty Fund had been created, a program to support businesses affected by U.S. tariffs. The funding amounted to about $1.2 billion, half of which went to modernizing production lines and creating new jobs. In a few months, the unemployment rate in Ontario's industrial sector fell by 0.8%. Against the backdrop of a global recession, it looked almost like an economic miracle. But the true significance of what was happening was deeper. For the first time in decades, Canada was not just reacting to U.S. decisions, it was setting the tone. And that tone was noticeable. American television channels, such as Fox News and CNN, showed footage of Ford's speech discussing Canadian audacity. On social media, the video from the Imperial Club garnered millions of views, and the phrase "elephant in the room" became a political meme. Even in Congress, questions were being asked. Had the tariff policy gone too far? If even the closest allies were now beginning to resist? Trump, according to sources, was furious. In private conversations, he called the speech disloyal and threatened serious consequences. But as the following months showed, Washington underestimated the effect. When one of the largest American companies, a manufacturer of aluminum profiles, announced that it was transferring some of its orders to Canada to circumvent its own tariffs, it became clear that economics are stronger than slogans.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Meanwhile, changes began to take place in Ontario that were not visible on the surface. Small businesses that had previously been dependent on American contracts began to look for new markets. Exports to Europe grew by 9%, and orders for lithium and nickel processing by 14%. The province spoke of a new Northern Course policy where Canada is no longer a junior partner but an independent player. When the Premier spoke to the press again a month after his speech, he said a simple phrase: "We are not looking for confrontation. We are simply no longer bowing our heads." This became a kind of credo for Ontario's entire policy. While Ottawa cautiously built dialogue with Washington, Toronto took action. Some economists called it populism, others called it new pragmatism. But the facts spoke for themselves. In the fourth quarter of 2025, investment inflows into Ontario's industrial sector grew by 12%, and the number of new factory construction permits reached a 7-year high. It was not a rebellion, but a demonstration of maturity.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
It all started with a single sentence uttered in the glittering hall of the Imperial Club, where the audience was expecting a banal diplomatic evening. It ended with the formation of a new political course that changed not only Canada's domestic economy, but also its place in the North American balance. Now that analysts are calling that dinner the beginning of a new era of Canadian protectionism in reverse, it is clear that this was not just a protest against Trump's tariffs. It was a statement that Canada no longer intends to play second fiddle in the economic orchestra conducted from Washington. And for the first time in a long time, audiences in New York, Washington, and Chicago heard not apologies but a voice of confidence from their northern neighbors. It was this moment when a light-hearted joke turned into a challenge that marked the beginning of a new fault line in US-Canada relations. A line that, as the events of the following months showed, would not disappear.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
When the initial impact of the tariff conflict began to subside, it became clear that a shift had taken place that was much deeper than a simple exchange of economic measures. What began as Ontario's political response to Washington's protectionism gradually turned into a new economic course for the whole of Canada. Ontario became the epicenter of this transformation, not just a province, but a model of how the country could survive and even thrive in an era of tariff wars. US tariffs, designed to weaken Canadian manufacturing, had the opposite effect. Within a few months, businesses that had feared losses began to adapt. Toronto, Hamilton, Kitchener, and Sudbury saw a revival in the industrial sector. Export Development Canada reported that the number of companies requesting insurance and credit for transactions with Europe and Asia had grown by almost a third. This was a clear signal. Canadian manufacturers no longer intended to be dependent on a single market. European partners, tired of American trade threats, began to view Canada as a stable platform. Within a few months of the tariff war escalating, the share of orders from Germany and France in Ontario's export structure doubled. Even Japanese companies, traditionally cautious, began to move part of their production chains to Canada, seeing this as a way to avoid instability in the US.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The provincial government seized the moment. Tax breaks were introduced for companies creating domestic supply chains, as well as new grants for the development of technologies in the field of clean production nickel, lithium, and copper processing. These were not just economic decisions. They were a demonstration of a new philosophy: make it in Canada, sell it to the world. A year after the conflict began, the number of new industrial permits had grown by 12%, and the number of jobs in metal processing and auto components by 8%. But behind the statistics lay something more: a psychological shift. For the first time in a long time, Canadian business felt not fear of Washington, but confidence in its own autonomy. At Chamber of Commerce meetings, phrases that until recently had been considered politically provocative began to be heard. We don't need their approval. Paradoxically, the harder Trump pushed with tariffs, the faster the confidence grew that Canada should go its own way. Tariffs designed to bring manufacturing back to America began to work against it. American companies complained about rising material prices, delivery delays, and lost contracts. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the number of jobs in industry fell by 78,000 in 5 months. At the same time, Canadian companies began to increase exports within the country. Trade between provinces grew by 9%, and even small manufacturers, previously completely dependent on the U.S., began to open markets in British Columbia and Alberta.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
In Washington, this trend caused irritation and growing bewilderment. The White House expected Canada to take a wait-and-see approach, as it had done before, but instead, Ontario acted swiftly and independently. Questions were raised in Congress. Why was it a provincial leader, rather than the federal prime minister, who became the main opponent of U.S. economic policy? The media wrote about unexpected Canadian boldness, and analysts on CNBC discussed that this was the most serious manifestation of North American economic sovereignty in the last 30 years. Meanwhile, unrest began in the border states. The governors of Michigan and New York warned that raising tariffs on Canadian goods would hurt their own businesses. Associations of automakers and energy companies demanded clarity and predictability. According to estimates by one research center, Canada's retaliatory measures increased the cost of production for American factories in the Great Lakes region by 4.7%. Against the backdrop of an election year, this became a political problem.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The Canadian federal government, observing the effect, did not intervene. Ottawa understood that Ontario was doing what the capital itself would not dare to do, testing the limits of what was permissible. And, to the surprise of many, the limits did not collapse. On the contrary, the U.S. began to cautiously seek avenues for negotiation. Unofficial sources claimed that White House representatives were trying to negotiate a reduction in some tariffs, fearing a further deterioration in relations with a key trading partner. But perhaps the most noticeable consequence of this new policy was a change in the perception of Canada itself. Whereas it had previously been viewed as the second wing of the North American market, it was now being talked about as an independent player capable of dictating its own terms. European experts wrote about the Canadian model of sustainability, a combination of pragmatism, social responsibility, and a confident national course.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
All this could not fail to affect the domestic mood. Business surveys conducted by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business recorded a steady increase in optimism. For the first time since the start of the trade war, more than half of companies said they were planning to expand production. Small businesses, which had suffered from the initial impact of tariffs, began hiring again. Ontario's industrial belt saw a resurgence in orders for auto parts, electric vehicle components, and renewable energy equipment.
And that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to
an agreement that works, but there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
But the most symbolic effect came from what was happening in the American press. The Atlantic magazine published an article titled, "When Canada Said No." The author wrote that what was once considered a soft northern neighbor has turned into a force ready to defend its own interests without approval from Washington. Conservative publications, on the other hand, accused Canada of betraying its alliance obligations, although the actual figures told a different story. Trade between the countries remained active, but the conditions began to change in favor of greater interdependence.